Hello, my friends. Jenny Boylan here, checking in from New York City today with a short piece that I thought I would share with you as part of this wonderful convocation of women and writers from around the world. The piece I wanted to share with you today is entitled "Trans Rights and Abortion Rights Are Two Sides of the Same Coin." And it goes like this. We were at the sinks in the ladies' room, the stranger and I, washing our hands when a trans woman came out of a stall, looked in the mirror, and sighed. After she left, the stranger turned to me and said, "Can you believe that? A man in here." She shook her head disapprovingly. That was 20 years ago, but I've never forgotten that stranger's disdain. It has stayed with me because the moment called for me to respond to her with courage. But what I delivered instead was cowardice. "I don't think she's doing anybody any harm," I said quietly, and then I rushed out. What I didn't say was, "I'm trans too." I didn't tell her that I knew firsthand what it was like in the early stages of transition to face the constant threat of judgment and cruelty, even violence, or that I knew all too well how much a difference a single touch of kindness could make during that very hard time. I thought back to that exchange as the issue of trans rights and trans identity has joined, if not displaced, abortion as one of the go-to issues riling up the conservative base. When I came out in 2000, Republicans barely registered trans identity, let alone attacked it. Now, more than 2 decades later, we've become the right's favorite boogeyman and boogie women. So effective has the orchestrated blowback become that Florida, the state where I once joyfully vacationed with my family, has become a place that I'm afraid now even to visit. I would no sooner retire there than I would consider retiring to North Korea. To some degree, we've arrived at this moment because abortion and trans rights are, in some ways, two sides of the same coin, issues that go to the core of what we mean by bodily autonomy and what kinds of choices individuals get to make about our private physical selves. We've also arrived at this moment because the same tactics that succeeded in marginalizing, demonizing, and even criminalizing abortion have been trained upon us. As Erin Carmen reported in New York Magazine on the melding of these two movements, quote, "We've reached the point of cross-pollination." Now that anti-abortion efforts following the Dobbs decision aren't proving to be the political win that Republicans had hoped, many are doubling down on the belief that demonizing the 0.6% of Americans over the age of 12 who identify as trans and the 1.2 million adults in America who identify as non-binary is a surefire ticket to electoral success. What are those tactics? Well, for one, conservative political strategists and GOP presidential hopefuls alike have taken to describing the more controversial aspects of trans experience as the defining issues, just as they have long exaggerated the frequency of exceedingly rare abortions performed later in pregnancy, pretending that these are routine. For the record, abortions occurring at or after 21 weeks of pregnancy represent less than 1% of all legal abortions performed in the United States in 2020. This same group of conservatives has also exploited Americans' impatience with nuance to define extremely complex issues in the most simplistic of terms. Finally, they've taken advantage of the fact that many Americans think they don't know a transgender person, at least in part, because just like me in that bathroom, so many of us choose to be invisible out of weariness or out of fear, just as so many American women never share that decision to terminate a pregnancy is one that they've had to make themselves. It's not just dangerous rhetoric. In 2023 alone, some 20 states banned or limited gender-affirming care for minors. Similar legislation is being debated in a number of others. Conservatives began by claiming they were protecting children, despite protests from the American Academy of Pediatrics that trans children should, quote, have access to comprehensive, gender-affirming, and developmentally appropriate health care that is provided in a safe and inclusive clinical space, end quote. But they're now attempting even to restrict care for adults. In 2022, Governor Ron DeSantis of Florida stripped trans people of their Medicare access to gender-affirming health care. That action was struck down by a federal judge, but similar bans are in the works nationwide. If you only listen to Republicans on this issue, you might be forgiven for thinking that the most important issue for transgender women in this country is the right to play on a female sports team, or that we believe that every 6-year-old who expresses uncertainty about their gender ought to be immediately taken to a clinic and administered puberty blockers, or that every predator serving time in prison deserves immediate and unfettered access to the showers in the women's prison. This, even though a 2015 survey found that trans people are 10 times as likely to be sexually assaulted by their fellow inmates and 5 times as likely to be sexually assaulted by prison staff members. You might even believe that detransitioning and transition regret are commonplace instead of rare, widely believed to be about 1%. All of these stories leave out the happy and successful trans folks I've met over the course of my life. Doctors, airplane pilots, a small town manager, a fire captain, even an astrophysicist whose primary desire has always been to simply get on with their lives and to spend their days in peace. I've often said that the most important thing needed to understand trans people is what has been termed the moral imagination, the ability to understand what the experience of being human is like for people who are different from ourselves. But how can strangers learn about us if they don't know us? Conservatives have succeeded in demonizing trans people in part because so many Americans have said they've never known anyone who's trans. In part, this is because our numbers are small, but it's also, in part, because many people post-transition are not immediately readable as trans. It's important to see that it's important to note that lots of us don't pass and aren't particularly interested in passing, but for many of us, especially the older members of the cohort, blending in with the rest of society has been at least an occasional goal. In part, this is because we've found our peace, but it's also because anonymity can protect us from violence. Knowing a person who's had an abortion, just like knowing someone who is trans, can change Americans' opinions about it. Only 50% of people who say they don't know anyone who's had an abortion think it should be legal in most or all cases. But 69% of people who say they have an acquaintance who's had an abortion